In 1880, one corporation had gained control over roughly 90-95% of America's oil refining, not by discovering more oil but by mastering the machinery of control. That fact matters because it reveals something most people still misunderstand about modern capitalism. The true superpower is not invention, it is architecture. John D. Rockefeller didn't merely build a business. He engineered a repeatable design, one that turns markets into corridors, competitors into footnotes, and public rules into private advantages. And once that design exists, it doesn't vanish when a company is punished, broken, or renamed. A firm can die. A method can migrate. To see how, you have to return to the world that produced him, the violent adolescence of industrial America. In the 1860s, oil was not yet the sacred blood of geopolitics. It was a commodity of lighting, kerosene for lamps, pulled from the ground through speculation, luck, and ruin. Prices swung like a pendulum because drilling was chaos. Too much supply collapsed margins. Too little supply triggered panic. For most people, the oil rush looked like opportunity. To Rockefeller, it looked like waste. He chose not to gamble on finding oil. He chose to control what happened after oil was found. That decision sounds small until you understand the difference between a prospector and an organizer. Prospectors compete on chance. Organizers compete on systems. And systems, once built, keep winning even when the original builder is gone. Rockefeller's first insight was brutally simple. If a refinery depends on other people for barrels, shipping, storage, and distribution, then the refinery is not a refinery, it is a hostage. So he began buying the parts around the refinery, the unglamorous pieces that outsiders treated as separate businesses. The barrels, the storage, the transport, the routes, the middlemen, the quiet choke points where costs accumulate and bargaining power lives. This is what vertical integration really is. Not efficiency as a slogan, but ownership as a strategy. When you own the bottleneck, you can do two things at once. You can lower your own costs, and you can raise the costs of everyone who refuses to submit. That second ability is where markets stop behaving like markets. That is where a competitive arena becomes a controlled environment. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil was no longer playing the same game as other refiners. It was changing the terrain beneath them. Researchers and historians have long documented the outcome. By 1879, Standard commanded more than 90% of U.S. refining, but Rockefeller's second insight was even darker. Cost advantage is not the finish line, it is the weapon. If you can produce cheaper than anyone else, you can temporarily sell cheaper than anyone else. And if your balance sheet can survive the storm longer than theirs, a price war becomes a demolition tool. The public sees discounts, rivals see extinction. In Cleveland, this logic became a lesson the entire corporate world would later memorize. Offer to buy. If they refuse, squeeze margins until the refusal becomes impossible. Then buy what's left, often with the very cash generated by the expanding system. This is not the romance of entrepreneurship. It is the mathematics of consolidation. And consolidation, once it starts, rarely stops on moral grounds. It stops only when it collides with law, politics, or the limits of legitimacy. That collision did come. The backlash against concentrated power produced antitrust enforcement strong enough to do what citizens demanded: shatter and loot. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil dismantled. Most people interpret that moment as a victory of democracy over monopoly. Rockefeller interpreted it as a test of design, because the point of an architecture is not that it resists storms. The point is that it survives them. The pieces of Standard Oil did not fall into the ocean. They reorganized into a constellation. And ownership, distributed across the fragments, allowed wealth to persist through the breakup. The corporation was attacked. The method endured. Here is where the story becomes modern. When you hear the word monopoly, you likely picture a single company dominating a single product. But the dominant power of the 21st century is often not a single product. It is a platform. It is infrastructure. It is the invisible layer that other businesses must rent in order to exist. That is vertical integration reborn. Not in barrels and railcars, but in servers and logistics, in payment rails and data. Consider Amazon's trajectory. It began as a retailer. It became an operating system for commerce. Warehouses, fulfillment, last mile delivery, payments, advertising, and most critically, the cloud infrastructure that vast portions of the digital economy rely on. In 2024, Amazon Web Services generated $107.6 billion in sales, and it has become central to Amazon's profitability and leverage. This is the Rockefeller pattern in a new costume. Control the pipes, and you influence everything that flows through them. Now consider information itself. Search is not merely a product. It is a gateway to knowledge, consumption, and political perception. StatCounter's global data has shown Google's worldwide share hovering around the high 80s to now 90% range in recent periods, so dominant that a small dip still leaves an empire. And dominance becomes even more resilient when the customer believes the service is free, because then the payment is not a price tag, it is behavior, it is data, it is dependence. Social networks follow the same gravitational law. When a platform surpasses billions of users, it stops being a website and becomes a social utility. As of late 2024, Facebook reported more than 3 billion monthly active users, a scale that turns competition into a rounding error unless challengers can replicate an entire society. This is why the old language fails us. We keep asking whether a company is too big. The sharper question is whether a company has become a layer, whether it has become a compulsory corridor. And once a corridor exists, regulation itself becomes the next frontier. Rockefeller understood early that the law is not merely a constraint, it is also a tool. If you can influence standards, you can define what counts as acceptable, safe, licensed, or compliant. You can turn complex rules into barriers that only the largest incumbents can afford to cross. That is not a conspiracy. It is a structural incentive built into modern governance. Regulators need expertise. Industry provides it. And the boundary between oversight and partnership becomes porous. Finally, Rockefeller added the last ingredient, one that would echo long after his refineries stopped roaring: legitimacy. In a society that fears concentrated wealth, the wealthy must purchase more than assets. They must purchase acceptance. They must build a narrative in which dominance is presented as stewardship and power is framed as public service. That is the strategic function of institutional philanthropy. It can do genuine good while also shaping priorities, funding frameworks, and public perception. In the modern era, large foundations, such as the Gates Foundation, which has reported an endowment around 77 billion in 2024, show how philanthropic capital can operate at near-state scale in selected domains. The point is not to deny the benefits. The point is to recognize the leverage. So the Rockefeller story is not merely about oil. It is about a formula that transforms economic advantage into political durability, and political durability back into economic advantage. A loop, a machine, an architecture. And if you live inside an architecture, your individual choices, what you buy, where you search, how you communicate, can start to feel like freedom while functioning like rooting. You are not always choosing between competing systems. Often, you are choosing between doors inside the same building. In part 2, we'll bring this to its sharpest edge. Why breakups so often fail to break the method. How modern holding structures and platform economics can outmaneuver classic regulation. And what a strategic citizen, or a strategic state, must do when markets quietly evolve into managed ecosystems. A system survives not because it is loved, but because it is useful, to someone powerful enough to keep it standing. That is the uncomfortable lesson hiding inside the Standard Oil story. The breakup was real. The headlines were righteous, and yet the deeper machinery kept turning because the machinery was never only about oil. It was about converting scale into durability, and durability into a kind of private sovereignty. In the modern economy, we keep treating monopoly like a crime scene, something you can cordon off, investigate, and dismantle. But in practice, monopoly is often a pattern of incentives. And incentives do not surrender simply because a court issues an order. To understand why, you have to look at what enforcement is truly up against. Antitrust law can cut a giant into pieces, but it struggles to change the weather that allowed the giant to grow. In the United States, the very agencies tasked with guarding competition now publicly emphasize concentration metrics like the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, and the 2023 merger guidelines revived tougher structural presumptions, such as treating markets as highly concentrated around HHI 1 800 and scrutinizing mergers that add 100 plus points of concentration. That is an important institutional shift. But a guideline is not a guarantee. The real battlefield is not the paper threshold. It is the lived reality of markets where power has moved from products to platforms, from factories to networks, from price tags to data extraction. Because the modern monopoly often does not look like a single firm crushing rivals in public. It looks like an ecosystem. And ecosystems defend themselves in three ways. First, they become infrastructure. When a firm controls the pipes, logistics, payments, cloud hosting, app stores, identity layers, every competitor becomes a tenant. Even if a rival exists, it is forced to breathe through the incumbent's oxygen mask. Second, they become law-shaped. Regulation is not only a guardrail, it is also an engineering specification. If the rulebook becomes complex enough, it favors those who can afford compliance armies, litigation budgets, and permanent relationships with policymakers. And third, they become legitimacy-shaped. A corporation that is merely profitable can be attacked. A corporation that is perceived as necessary becomes politically resilient. Once a platform is treated like a utility, social connection, search, payment, cloud, healthcare access, then any serious disruption triggers fear. Jobs, prices, services, national security. The public begins to defend what it once distrusted because daily life is wired into it. This is why the Rockefeller method outlives Rockefeller. It manufactures dependency, and dependency is political capital. Look at the energy sector. U.S. refining is not a folklore market of countless small players. It is a capital-intensive system where scale matters. As of January 2024, U.S. crude oil refining capacity was about 18.38 million barrels per day, and the largest refiners hold substantial shares. Marathon alone was reported around 16%, Valero around 12%, with Exxon also among the top tier. Those numbers are not simply market facts. They are a warning about the structural logic of industries where the cost of entry is so high that competition becomes a rare event rather than a permanent condition. You can regulate behavior, yes, but the industrial geometry keeps pulling the market back toward concentration. Now look at the political layer, the part polite conversations avoid. In 2024, U.S. federal lobbying spending reached a record level, around $4.4 billion, according to Open Secrets reporting. That figure is not just trivia, it is the price of participating in rulemaking at scale. It is how a system defends itself before any courtroom battle begins. When money consistently flows into influence, the default outcome is not dramatic corruption. The default outcome is quieter. Technical language, carve-outs, exemptions, delays, procedural fog, policy that looks neutral while quietly preserving incumbency. This is what regulatory capture often becomes in advanced economies, not a bribe, but a relationship. And once that relationship exists, the system does not need to be openly authoritarian. It only needs to be complicated enough that ordinary people cannot see the levers. Then there is the economic payoff, the part that makes the architecture worth maintaining. In the United States, official data shows corporate profits from current production increased by about $281.3 billion in 2024, compared with a $229.8 billion increase in 2023. Again, the point is not moral outrage. The point is strategic clarity. When profit rises, the incentive to protect the structures that generate it rises as well, through lobbying, acquisitions, litigation, and the careful shaping of public narratives. So why does the breakup remedy often fail to break the method? Because the method is not tied to one corporate logo. It is tied to 5 repeatable moves. A dominant firm integrates vertically, not only to cut costs but to control choke points. It consolidates horizontally, not only to grow but to make competition statistically unlikely. It structures ownership through parent-subsidiary complexity, not only for efficiency but for insulation. It influences regulators, not only to reduce risk but to shape the definition of risk itself. And it purchases legitimacy, not only to be admired but to become untouchable. If you want the Rockefeller lesson in one sentence, it is this. Modern power is less about owning a market and more about owning the conditions under which markets operate. That is why the system feels inescapable, because it is not a cage with bars. It is a building where every hallway leads back to the same set of landlords. So what does a strategic response look like? One that is neither naive rebellion nor passive surrender. It begins with abandoning the comforting myth that you can opt out as an individual. You cannot meaningfully boycott an architecture, but architectures can be redesigned if you know what to redesign. The first strategic lever is transparency of dependency, mapping the corridors. Which firms are infrastructure rather than vendors? Which markets are genuinely competitive, and which are ecosystems with one or two landlords? This is not academic work. It is the prerequisite for policy that targets choke points rather than headlines. The second lever is competition, where it is still possible. Interoperability, portability, open standards. When users can move data, identity, payments, social graphs, then incumbency becomes a little less permanent. The point is not to punish size for being large. The point is to prevent size from becoming destiny. The third lever is anti-capture engineering, strengthening institutional capacity so regulators are not forced to borrow the industry's brain to write the industry's rules. If expertise must be imported, it should be imported with strict conflict controls and public accountability. The fourth lever is structural rather than theatrical antitrust. A headline breakup can be emotionally satisfying, but structural enforcement targets the behaviors that recreate monopolies: exclusive dealing, self-preferencing, discriminatory access to platforms, mergers that quietly remove future competitors before they become visible threats. That is precisely why concentration metrics and presumptions matter, because they shift the default posture from prove harm after the fact to prevent harm before it hardens. And the fifth lever, the hardest one, is cultural. Rebuilding a public philosophy that understands efficiency is not the same thing as freedom, because the Rockefeller system offers a bargain. It offers cheaper goods, faster services, smoother logistics, instant answers. And in exchange, it asks for something most people do not realize they are paying: the right to meaningful alternatives. That trade can be rational in the short run and dangerous in the long run. A society can become materially comfortable while strategically dependent. It can become wealthy in aggregate while fragile in the hands of a few nodes. And when those nodes break, or when they decide to squeeze, there is no quick exit route, because the exit routes were purchased years earlier through consolidation. So the real warning is not that the system is evil. The warning is that the system is efficient enough to be forgiven, stable enough to be normalized, and complex enough to be misunderstood, until the day it stops serving the public and starts openly serving itself. If part 1 was the origin story, part 2 is the diagnosis. Rockefeller's greatest invention was not an oil empire. It was the idea that control can be designed, embedded into supply chains, legal forms, standards, and legitimacy, so that even when the company is attacked, the architecture remains. And once you see that, you stop asking the soft question, who is the villain? You start asking the strategic question, where are the corridors and who owns the doors?